Welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we're recording this on February 24th, 2023, and I'm glad to have another happy warrior on the show, someone who's fighting for economic freedom and liberty and doing some sound economic research in this area. And it's none other than Dr. Vincent Geloso. And by the way, Vincent, did I say that correctly? Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yep, you did.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, it's really good to have you on. And let me go ahead for the audiences, go ahead and give you your bio, and then we'll jump right in with some good discussion here. Vincent was born and raised in St. Lambert on the South Shore of Montreal in Canada. Vincent completed his PhD in economic history at the London School of Economics in June 2016. His research centers on the historical measurement of living standards and inequality, public economics, population economics, and political economy, in no particular order of preference. Those are all good things. He received his undergraduate degree from Montreal University in economics and politics. He is currently assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. Previously, he was assistant professor of economics at King's University College and visiting assistant professor of economics at Bates College. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at Texas Tech University, guns up, as part of its Free Market Institute. He has more than 60 peer-reviewed articles with many in top-ranked academic journals, and several of them that have just been published recently, which have really brought about the importance of economic freedom, the ability for more economic growth and prosperity, economic mobility, income inequality, some of the things that we want to discuss today. So, without further ado, the first question that I like to ask my guests to really get an idea of how you think and where you've come from to get to where you are today. What motivates you, Vincent, to do what you do?
So I'm originally from the French part of Canada, which means I come from an area where people are on average more left-leaning than people in Vermont, to kind of give you an idea of where things stand. So I started being a social democrat when I was a kid. I say a kid, like 18, 19. But gradually, as I became an econ student, became very interested in classical liberal ideas, became very enamored by Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek, and later on people like Doug Nort and Bob Fogel. And I was like, I need to be an economist. This is the way to live. It's the correct way to see the world. And gradually, as this came along, I moved towards being a very clean free marketeer, motivating my research on economic freedom, working in think tanks in Canada and the US, but also while doing my PhD, convinced that there needs to be a case made for markets and more economic freedom in society for generating growth, generating better outcomes, even though there are trade-offs. But on net, these are harbingers of higher living standards, higher quality of life, and been arguing this for, I want to say, like 10, 15 years now. Don't want to say my age, but been making that case for some time now.
Well, excellent, Vincent. I think it's a great way to go. I mean, one of the my mentors is Peter Boettke, and he talks about mainline economics versus mainstream economics, and it seems like you're much in line with that more mainline economics. Is that right?
Yep. So the mainstream is, you can think of Harvard, Princeton, Yale. That's the mainstream. The mainline is, you think about the big names: Doug Nort, Ronald Coase, Gary Becker, Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek. And what we emphasize is process of markets, the importance of institutions, the importance of property rights, the importance of even the core sentence is that the production of rules itself a productive activity, and people can generate rules to govern themselves, and they're very good at that. And we just need to understand the process of creation of rules. James Buchanan as well, 1986 laureate in economics. I'm very much in agreement with Pete when he says this mainline. Mainline is the interest in the classical questions of how do we get good institutions that generate human prosperity.
That's right. And I mean, it's also about private property rights, right? And having these institutional framework in place with private property rights, rules of the game, things of that nature, where there's very limited government at the end of the day. I mean, I'm also a classical liberal and come from that sort of mind, train of thought, where right now I see a lot from the political left and right here in the United States is starting to go more towards big government from both sides in many cases, and has been for a long time. I think it's more pronounced now, especially on the right, of trying to come out and socially engineer society. And I think what we've seen throughout history, Douglas North talks about this a lot, is that these institutions matter. And if you want people to flourish, you really need free markets, economic freedom, those sort of things with very limited government touch, right?
Yep, I'll say I'm in agreement with this. I always say we can say it a bit differently here and there. The idea is once once you have, which we should, like, this is probably the best way to summarize it. We should never put our dreams and hopes into having the correct leaders. We should put our dreams and hope in having the rules that incentivizes even the most horrible leader to do the right thing. And that's like the core of what I would say is the classical liberal way of viewing the task of an economist, is how do we get good institutions? Then everything becomes details of, like, what's the shape of property rights? What's the optimal size of government? But we agree that there are points where if we make bad rules if we give bad incentives to politicians, they will generate bad rules and they will generate bad outcomes. It's better that we focus on getting good rules, and the players then become secondary.
Well said. I think that's a great way to put it. And we were talking a little bit before we started recording, kind of geeking out a little bit about, things like people like Douglas North and the work that he was able to do on institutions and how those matter. And reading some of your research, which I'll put up on our show notes page at vancegann.com, your research also digs into that. What have you been researching in that sort of area with institutions and economic freedom? And then we'll kind of dig in some of more of the details of your most recent work.
So I got interested mostly in the role of institutions later on in my career because I was interested in the origins of divergence between countries. So I started digging into what's the role of, say, certain labor regime arrangements. So I do work, for example, on Canada. The French part of Canada is poorer than the United States, poorer than the rest of English Canada. And some people have argued for long that it was for some cultural reason, whereas when you actually look at it, there was bad institutions that created in certain geographical areas, created monopolies, limited competition, limited the property rights generally of the French Canadians. And then I point out that if you want to explain divergence within North America, then institutions play a really big deal in explaining that. And even if you look, for example, you compare French Canadians with Argentinians in like 1900, they're actually equally poor. So it's a story where the initial divergence that's observed at the beginning of the 20th century is entirely due to bad institutions in the French part of Canada and that are somewhat similar to those in Argentina. So the story then becomes, well, divergence is linked to institutions. Convergence thus must be linked with good institutions. And from there, it was easy for me to step into other stuff that are either about institutions historically, the emergence of property rights, the creation of governance when the state is weak, when people find ways to create governance in like statelessness, essentially, or entirely just ask questions about modern economic development in link with economic freedom. So, for example, how correctly are we estimating the impact of economic freedom on GDP per capita, on income mobility, on income inequality, who gains from economic freedom, the distribution of the gains of economic freedom. So it was easy for me to step from one literature, which is a Doug North historical origins of good institutions, to, well, let's see how we would get good institutions today and how much they matter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Vincent. And I think it's important for us to understand how those institutions help a thriving, flourishing economy with the market process in order to allow for that marketplace to work. I've had some good conversations on this podcast with Samuel Gregg, Alex Salter, and others talking a lot about, those institutions, whether it be in monetary policy with monetary rules or fiscal policy with fiscal rules. These institutions and keeping, like you said earlier, politicians within some tracks without going too far one way or the other is really important. Something that's really drawn me to your work, Vincent, is the connection that you've been able to show and do some research on dealing with income mobility, income inequality, and the relationship that has with economic freedom. There are different measures of economic freedom. One of those that I'm the most familiar with is the Fraser Institute, which has been around for a while, of economic freedom of North America. Dean Stanzel, a good friend, has done. He's also, I'll have a podcast with him. And there's also economic freedom of the world. Bob Lawson, another key one there at SMU, and he's been on the show as well.
Lots of Texas people.
Yeah, I know. So we have good information there if you're coming from Texas. But I wonder, kind of where do you start, kind of with your measure of economic freedom that you look at, and how those connections are with income mobility and income inequality?
I'd say that the pitch I've been making for years is that inequality is not like a hodgepodge of the same thing. There's different types of inequality. There are good inequality. So, for example, if I'm a Benedictine monk and you're a hedge fund banker and you're earning more than I am and your income increases, but if offered to swap places with you, I refuse, then it's not a bad inequality in and of itself. This is actually the result of choices we should expect in rich societies that are so rich that people can find ways to be happy in very heterogeneous ways. There will be some form of inequalities, but they don't speak to inequality in well-being. They speak to inequality that result from people actually picking the choices that make them happiest in a space of freedom that is much larger, both in terms of because they have access to resources or because legally they're allowed to. But then there's like bad inequalities. Bad inequalities would be the one where we'd say, okay, by dint of birth, you have fewer opportunities than the other guy, or by dint of regulation, you can't enter this market where this guy is getting like a privileged status. He's getting privilege, so he's getting rents, he's getting higher incomes than he would normally have, and you are deprived of an opportunity to provide your skills to someone who would be willing to purchase the fruits thereof. So this is a bad inequality. Then what it means is my theory is one of we can institutionally break down the sources of inequality. There will be good and bad inequalities we should have no moral statement about, those and some that we should have statements about. When we look at societies where there is a high economic freedom, we observe that the bad inequalities are much smaller. So there is greater chances at income mobility, so you can move up, which means that your inherited conditions are much, inequality at the start line, if you want to think about it this way, is much less of a big deal in economically free societies. And not only that, but it's easier to rise up in these economically free societies. So it matters more for the poor to be in an economically free society than it does for the rich. So that's the point I've been making. And economic freedom is the channel by which people can climb up. And that's like what I'm summarizing like 5 articles in like a sentence here, because I know you want to do this in 30 minutes. I could talk about this for hours, but essentially the idea is economic freedom matters far more for people at the bottom of the ladder because they need opportunities they need to not be blocked ways up. And that's the pitch I've been making. And this is the type of inequality that we should be offended about. And like people who are politically active and on the left, say like a congressman from Brooklyn, New York, could actually, I'm not targeting anyone in particular, could actually be in agreement with me that this is something that's hurtful and we should remove these regulations or these barriers that limit the chances of the very poor to climb up.
That makes sense, Vincent. And I think when you're looking at economic freedom, there's a lot of measures that go into that, right? There's government spending, there's taxes, there's regulations, there's property rights, there's money. How sound is the money? There's a lot of different measures. Are there certain measures that you think from your research are more important than others?
Yep. So I've done research on Canadian income mobility and intergenerational mobility. So the Canadian one was because I'm from Canada, but it was within the same people over 5 years. So it wasn't relative to their parents. And the one I did that was international was international, but relative to your parents. So in both cases, regulation is a big deal. Regulation does hinder the chances of going up in the ladder. So seeing your absolute income increase in a 5-year window or over a generation, but also reduces your chances of rising up relative to where your parents started. So like say, if you were at the first centile, so you're the poorest 1%, are you going to increase above that relative position, even though everyone could be getting growth? So everyone like sees 10%, but are you able to go from like say first centile to 50th? So you go to the median or you go to the top. So can you move the entire income distribution? And what we find is regulation is the biggest depressor of both upward absolute mobility, so how much extra dollars you get, and how much you move relative to everybody else. Regulation is by far the biggest one. Internationally, property rights are a big deal as well. Size of government has ambiguous effects, largely because it's the redistribution governments do is actually helping in some ways, but the taxes reduce the rate of returns on, say, things like human capital, like going to university. When you make a choice of occupation, if the tax rates are really high, you're going to go in an occupation that maybe has fewer returns, but is more pleasant because the returns are going to be taxed so much more. So you get fewer doctors, but you also get like more high school teachers. Not necessarily like a bad thing to be a high school teacher. I'm saying that the positive effect on mobility of government spending is relatively zero because of the offset of taxes. Sound money doesn't seem to have a big impact, but that's because we don't have, in the data we're using, we don't have episodes of hyperinflation because of the timeline we're using. So maybe we're missing out on something. Freedom to trade has some impact, but it's relatively small. The bigger ones, property rights and regulations, are the biggest determining factors.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at regulations, I guess it's labor market regulations, other types of regulations that are specifically on businesses and being able to open, like doing business sort of regulations.
Occupational licensing as well.
Yeah.
Occupational licensing, business regulations, wage regulations, hiring and firing regulations. So the Economic Freedom Index that's generally used by the Fraser Institute doesn't have all of these things, but philosophically they speak also to these things. So hiring and firing regulations, payroll taxes will have something of a similar effect. Requirements of certain sizes of businesses that you need to have to do X or Y. Product regulation: who can you sell to? Who can you not sell to? Like in Canada, it's not as much a big deal in the US, but like for example in Canada, one of the bigger sets of like problems is no foreign provider of cell phones can enter the Canadian market. Canadian firms have to be owned by more than 80% by Canadians. So that limits international competition for cell phones. One reason why Canada has really high cell phone rates, depresses real incomes by making prices for some goods. Same thing for telecoms, airlines, mining industry. So you get like a lot of industry that are shielded from competition. So you get product regulation, essentially. You got foreign investment limitation, so that end up limiting the chances of increasing wages through making businesses more productive or having more competition in the economy. So economic freedom really does matter for giving chances upward. But there is, I should say, a direct effect, which is you don't want to prevent people from doing stuff, but there's an indirect effect by stimulating economic growth. One of the effects of economic growth is you give resources, you're creating extra resources that are available to people, and an extra dollar of income creates much more extra choices for people near the bottom of the income ladder than they do for people at the top. The additional gain of available choices is much bigger for the poor. So the indirect effect is if you're able to stimulate growth as well, you're actually creating more choice space for those at the bottom. So it's not just that you're not preventing them legally from going up, is you're actually creating conditions in which they can go up. In which there is opportunity to rise up. Also, richer societies have more scope for specialization. If you don't regulate this chance at specialization, you'll also allow them to climb up. So the indirect effect is in what me and my colleague Justin Calais from University of Louisiana at Lafayette case we make is actually when you pile it up, economic freedom's direct and indirect effect are so large that they offset any effective redistribution government does. That, like, if you were, say, to cut like social spending but also cut regulation at once, you would actually still get a reduction of inequality of income. You would still get a reduction of income inequality and an increase in income mobility, even though you'd be slashing transfer program. Not arguing that, but I'm saying that on net, the reason why I'm saying this is the impact of regulations and property rights is by far the most important.
Wow. That's huge, Vincent. I mean, a lot of legislators watch it or listen to this program, and it's part of the audience. And I think this is something that they should really take to heart: is that regulations matter. Property rights matter. These are things that are really important. They don't always get the headlines of what's going on in the news and everything else. That's usually government spending and taxes and things of that nature, but regulations are so important. Just a anecdote here is that I worked in the Trump White House. I was the chief economist for Office of Management and Budget for about a year, from June 2019 to May of 2020. And one of the things out of the Trump administration, there were some things that we could talk about that weren't as great, like the excessive government spending and the tariffs and the trade issues, which I was fighting against those all the time. But I think the deregulation that happened, especially those first couple of years of the Trump administration, were really huge for growth. We saw more economic growth. You also had the lowest poverty rate on record in 2019, the highest real median household income. And to your point, you also saw increasing economic income growth at the lower income levels more than the higher income levels. Now, all of them were growing, but there was a decreasing income inequality from partially from, I think, from that deregulation. There were also the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was going on. So it's kind of a combination of these issues. But I think there's a big argument there. I don't know if you've done any specific research in that area, but there was a lot of deregulation that was happening in that period. Have you done any research on that yet?
Not on the Trump stuff, but I can give you a parallel with Canada. So
Okay,
in
great.
Canada, there's been some provinces that have moved towards being like big jumps in economic freedom, in large part because of deregulation. The big example is Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are like basically are Montana and Dakotas, right? So like for people who are not familiar with Canada, these are the ones, right? They're just on top of these. But Quebec, where I'm from, didn't have that big of a jump. When you look at income mobility for people in the bottom 10%, you find that these provinces have had huge jumps in income mobility. So like the poor not only get like big income increases, they also jump up much more inside the distribution. So they go from say bottom 10 to like average, like to the median, or sometimes like very much higher. Whereas my province, which is not my initial province, which didn't deregulate in any way, any meaningful way, has had falling income mobility. Kind of a suggestion that regulation really does play a really big role in allowing people near the bottom to rise up. But another part that's interesting is actually it reduces the effect of deregulation, actually reduces the income of people who are very high in the distribution, suggesting that what was happening before is you were propping up their incomes by shielding them from competition, which is a bad thing.
Like regulatory capture, right?
Exactly. So you would get people who are getting rich by dint of their ability to access privileged contacts with politicians, but people near the bottom gained far more than is appreciated. So deregulation is really like a big deal for people near the bottom. And if you think like the one that would matter most right now in the US would be any form of occupational deregulation, like for example, my wife is shifting out of the law and trying to move into teaching, and the certification process in Virginia is insanely complicated and requires a large number of time to do this. But my wife is a qualified lawyer. She has a training in pure sciences. Before she went into law, she was a chemistry undergrad in one of our weird institutions in Quebec. So she had pure science training. She practiced law for 10 years in a mental hospital. The joke I make is that's how we met. But in the end, she still has like to do like a series of like very burdensome regulatory compliance, even though she's highly qualified. There's a lot of people who are stuck in certain career paths, or because the barriers to enter new professions are very expensive and probably are not linked to any form of quality considerations. They are linked to attempts to limit competition in these jobs. But the cost is some people don't access opportunities that would allow them a chance upwards. And that probably is the bigger deal of all the regulations that exist. Those would be the easiest to target first.
Yep. That makes sense. One thing, Vincent, that we've seen over the last few years here in the U.S., right, is that there's been a lot of movement from high tax, high spending, high regulatory states to states with lower taxes, lower regulation, lower government spending. The big ones that come to mind, right, are the ones that are moving from California and New York to Texas, which is where I live near Austin, Texas, and
which is not in Texas apparently.
Right.
This is a joke I've heard from a colleague. Is why don't you leave Austin and come to Texas?
Yes. So that's why I live in Round Rock, Texas, just outside of Austin, the People's Republic of Austin. That's right.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, there's about 1,000 people on average moving to Texas every day from other states. And I think some of that was due to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There was the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction, that they limited to $10,000, which ends up benefiting upper income people more, right? So even Democrats are in favor of getting rid of that and getting rid of that cap because it's hurting their states as people are leaving those states and moving elsewhere. And so that's contributing, I think, to some of this income mobility. But what other factors have you seen, like between the states? Because I think some of your research has also been looking at the states' economic freedom and mobility as well, right?
So So this is something that's in progress that I'm about to mention. So it's not, the results are not formal. I wouldn't quote myself yet on it, but I'm willing to mention it because it is consistent with other findings. It looks often like some states are having rising income inequality, but that's because they're getting a lot of influx of workers from abroad. So like when people move to the US, they generally move to the higher economic freedom states, more often than not. But because immigrants generally suffer some form of penalty in wages when so you take the distribution of immigrants earning, you compare them to Native Americans, you get like they're slightly poor just because they're not familiar with cultural norms in the United States, they're not familiar with some of the regulations, so they get some form of penalty. But once you adjust for that and you just look at Native Americans, like people who were born in the US, and you check what's happening to them, actually economic freedom makes inequality within that group fall. So they're growing and their incomes are growing. But this is like what this is known as the problem that this poses is the composition bias. It means you're being lured by the fact that poor people are moving towards places that are economically free because they know this is where their incomes will rise up the most. So it looks like Texas is a highly unequal place, but it's not. It's because poor people from California, poor people from Latin American countries are moving in, and they look like they're rising inequality, but it's actually because people perceive this as a less unequal place in terms of opportunities that are accessible. Once you correct for this which is known as a composition bias, you actually see that highly free economic freedom states actually are able to generate more opportunities that are well distributed across the income distribution. So that's something like that I would mention as highly important and why it would matter to the poor. Same thing, by the way, when we talk about like another finding is like this is for the minimum wage literature. That's also like a really bad thing for poor people. There's one finding that's been made recently which is that poor people flee states that have higher minimum wages, largely because they're not able to find jobs. And once you adjust for that, you actually find that the minimum wage has exactly the effect on employment rates that you think. It's because some people from the denominator of the employment rate are leaving to another states. So the results is actually people are fleeing these things that are these regulations, these barriers. It's probably because they have bad effects. And we should maybe remove them. I mean, I'm happy that they come to Texas or Virginia or places where the business environment is better and it's easier to rise up the income ladder, but it's still a cost to move. So that means that it's the cost. We could have been better off if they weren't being forced to move out to seek out opportunities.
Yep, that's right, Vincent. I think what also I was thinking about while you were talking there was that, it's important whenever we're thinking about people moving from one place to another, policies matter, these institutions matter, and everything else. And it's essential for those at the bottom to be able to move up, for us to have more economic freedom. Pete Becky actually talked about during our podcast interview was that, economics is really a study of how do we get the poorest among us to have a better life, to be able to, this struggle for a better world, right? His book, Struggle for a Better World, is how do you allow for more flourishing and prosperity? It's not that we just want to help the people at the top. It's more about how do we help the people at the bottom really move up? And so you had this discussion within economics about Thomas Piketty and others, where they're really, their influence is really having on more government to do the redistribution. But unfortunately, they don't have as much knowledge as the market processes through prices and the signals that are put in place and the knowledge that's gained throughout the market to allow for us to have that allocation of resources. And so they're going to get it wrong. They're going to have government failures, which is going to make the perceived market failures even worse and contribute to even a worse situation for those at the bottom. And so finally, kind of wrapping up here, Vincent, and it's been a great discussion here. Some of your latest research talks about dictators and and maybe how that could be influencing some of the economic freedom measures that are out there. Would you mind explaining some of that?
Yeah, so there's a well-documented tendency of dictators to lie about how rich their countries are, largely because it provides them with legitimacy. They look like they're competent. They're able to generate growth that looks like American or French or British growth. Well, British growth's not that great recently, but they are able to say that. But the reality is they're fudged up numbers, and we have ways of assessing this, and it's generally using satellite data about nighttime light intensity, which doesn't lie, right? The satellites don't lie, the dictators do. But when we estimate, say, the effect of economic freedom as a variable on income, and you do it with the data that has the dictators' lies in them, well, dictators are also places where they don't allow that much economic freedom. So you're understating by definition how much of an effect economic freedom has if the dictators lie and make their economically unfree country look richer than they really are. Once you use corrected data that actually that eliminates the lies, or at least a good part of the lies, you actually find that the effect of economic freedom is 10 to 33% bigger than the one we actually estimate in the literature. So the effect is even bigger than is commonly appreciated in terms of generating higher incomes.
Yep. And I think that's also important because if it was biased downward too much before, we weren't getting the same sort of insights from what economic freedom is bringing, especially to these poor places that have dictators that are really hurting the poorest among us even the most, right? So maybe we'll get even some more insights as we go forward there.
Yeah, so, just to give an idea, like 10% faster income growth rate, right? So let's say you're growing at 2% a year, and now I'm making this like go to 2.2. It looks like it's trivial to most people, but it's the difference between your income doubling every 36 years and your income doubling every 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. So a 10% difference is very big, and 33% difference is the difference between 2 and 2.6, and that's a difference between your income doubling every 20 years and every 36 years. Like it's a big deal. Like,
yes.
in the law of compound interest is a really, 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 really big deal.
Yes. Exactly right. Well, Vincent, this has been a great discussion. As we wrap up here, what else would you want to explain or provide insights for the audience here on how we can best let people prosper, moving forward?
Follow the classical economics tradition that we do not put our faith in particular men. We put our faith into rules and our hopes into the fact that we're not going to get the good players. We want the bad players to be forced to do the good thing.
All right. It's a great way to end it here. And Vincent, thank you for your time today. Thank you for all the work that you're doing to let people prosper. God bless you and your family. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation more so after this. And for the audience, please leave us a 5-star rating. You can find all of these notes and show notes for this episode at vanceginn.com or my Substack, vanceginn.substack.com. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And until next time, let people prosper.